September 1st, 1944. General George S. Patton stood over a map table at his Third Army headquarters in Chalon-sur-Marne, France. His finger traced a line from his current position to the Rhine River, 40 miles. That's all that separated his army from Germany's last natural defense. His staff officers watched as Patton calculated distances, fuel consumption, and German defensive positions. The math was simple. Give him 1 week of proper supply, and he'd be across the Rhine. Give him 2 weeks, and he'd be deep into Germany. Give him a month, and the war would be over. Patton looked up from the map. His face showed something between excitement and frustration. He knew what was possible. He also knew what was coming. Within 48 hours, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery would convince Supreme Commander Eisenhower to kill Patton's plan. Within 3 weeks, Montgomery's alternative operation would collapse in spectacular failure. Within 6 months, World War II would still be raging, and tens of thousands of additional soldiers would be dead. All because one British general couldn't bear to let an American general win the war. What happened in early September 1944 is one of the great tragedies of World War II. Patton had the plan, the momentum, and the enemy on the ropes. Montgomery had the ego, the political connections, and the fear that Patton would eclipse him forever. Eisenhower had an impossible choice between military opportunity and political necessity. The decision that was made extended World War II by at least 6 months and cost more lives than the entire D-Day invasion. To understand how one general's jealousy extended World War II, you need to understand September 1944, the moment when Germany was beaten, defenseless, and ready to collapse, and the moment when Allied politics threw away the greatest opportunity of the entire war. August 1944 had been a month of miracles. On July 25th, American forces broke out of the Normandy hedgerows in Operation Cobra. By August 1st, Patton's newly activated Third Army was racing across France. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By August 31st, Patton's lead elements had advanced over 400 miles in just 5 weeks. This wasn't normal warfare. This was pursuit of a broken enemy. The German army in France was destroyed. At the Falaise Gap, tens of thousands of German soldiers had been killed or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The survivors were streaming east in disorganized chaos, abandoning equipment, deserting in massive numbers. German commanders were reporting to Hitler that the Western Front had effectively collapsed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled to command German forces in the West, later described the situation in early September as hopeless. He had no continuous defensive line. He had no reserves. He had demoralized troops with no heavy weapons, no air cover, and no will to fight. The vaunted Siegfried Line along the German border was undermanned and unprepared. If the Allies had maintained their pressure in early September, von Rundstedt wrote after the war, Germany couldn't have stopped them. But maintaining pressure required fuel, and by September 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army was running on fumes. His tanks were stopping not because Germans were stopping them, but because there was no gasoline in their tanks. His trucks were being abandoned on roadsides, empty. His supply officers were performing miracles, scrounging fuel wherever they could find it, but it wasn't enough. The problem was logistics. Allied supplies were still coming through the Normandy beaches and the port of Cherbourg. Everything had to be trucked hundreds of miles to the advancing armies. The logistics system, called the Red Ball Express, was moving over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. But that wasn't enough to supply all the Allied armies advancing into France and Belgium. Patton's staff calculated they needed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day to maintain their advance. They were getting less than half that. On September 1st, Patton called Bradley and gave him the numbers. "Brad, if you give me 400,000 gallons of gasoline, I can be in Germany in 2 days. I can cross the Rhine in a week. Give me 2 weeks and I'll have the Ruhr industrial region. Give me a month and the war would be over." Bradley looked up from the map. His face showed something between excitement and frustration. He knew what was possible. He also knew what was coming. Within 48 hours, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery would convince Supreme Commander Eisenhower to kill Patton's plan. Within 3 weeks, Montgomery's alternative operation would collapse in spectacular failure. Within 6 months, World War II would still be raging, and tens of thousands of additional soldiers would be dead. All because one British general couldn't bear to let an American general win the war. September 2, 1944, Montgomery flew to Eisenhower's headquarters at Granville, France. He had requested an urgent meeting. He had a plan, a bold plan, an ambitious plan, a plan that would, he claimed, end the war by Christmas. Montgomery arrived with maps, logistics tables, and supreme confidence. He was about to propose Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's plan was breathtaking in scope. He wanted to drop 3 airborne divisions, the American 101st and 82nd and the British 1st Airborne, to capture bridges across the major rivers in Holland. Then he would drive his British 30th Corps 64 miles through German-held territory, link up with the paratroopers, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and break into northern Germany. One thrust, one concentrated blow, 64 miles in 3 days. Eisenhower listened to Montgomery's presentation. The plan was unlike anything Montgomery had ever proposed before. Montgomery, the cautious general who always wanted overwhelming force before attacking, was now proposing a risky airborne operation deep into enemy territory. Montgomery, who had spent months grinding slowly through Normandy, now wanted to dash 64 miles in 3 days. The transformation was remarkable and suspicious. Here's what Montgomery didn't say in that meeting. He didn't say that Patton was 40 miles from the Rhine and could cross it with 1 week of supply. He didn't say that the German army was already beaten and that maintaining pressure would finish them. He didn't say that his own plan would require stripping resources from every other Allied army. What Montgomery said was that his plan was the war winner, that a concentrated thrust would succeed where a broad advance would fail, that British forces should have priority because they were better positioned and better prepared. What Montgomery was really saying, though his words never made it explicit, was this: I cannot let Patton cross the Rhine before British forces do. I cannot let an American general win this war while I'm still fighting in Holland. I cannot let history remember George Patton as the man who defeated Germany, while Bernard Montgomery is remembered as the man who was too slow. Bradley wasn't at the September 2nd meeting. If he had been, he might have killed Market Garden before it started. Bradley understood Montgomery's real motive. He had watched Montgomery operate for 2 years. He had seen the jealousy, the credit stealing, the barely concealed contempt for American generals. Bradley knew that Montgomery's sudden embrace of aggressive tactics had nothing to do with military logic and everything to do with stopping Patton. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Militarily, Patton's plan made more sense. Patton had momentum. Patton was already near the Rhine. Patton had proven he could advance faster than anyone thought possible. But politically, Eisenhower couldn't ignore Montgomery. Montgomery was Britain's most famous general. Churchill supported him, the British public adored him, and Britain, exhausted after 5 years of war, needed to feel that British forces were still leading the fight. Eisenhower also had to consider that Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group, including all British and Canadian forces. If Eisenhower gave all the supplies to Patton and told Montgomery to wait, it would look like American forces were winning the war while British forces sat idle. The political explosion would be enormous. Churchill would be forced to intervene. The alliance might not survive. On September 4, 1944, Eisenhower made his decision. Montgomery would get priority for supplies. Market Garden would be launched. Patton's advance would be slowed to a crawl. The fuel trucks that should have been going to the Third Army would go north to Montgomery's forces instead. When Bradley told Patton about Eisenhower's decision, Patton exploded. He paced his headquarters, cursing, throwing maps, predicting disaster. His staff had never seen him so angry. Patton told Bradley that Montgomery's plan would fail. He said the Germans would have time to reinforce their positions. He said the war would be extended by months. He said soldiers would die in battles that shouldn't have to be fought. Then Patton said something that Bradley recorded in his diary. "Brad, Monty is not trying to end the war. He's trying to stop me from ending it. He'd rather see this war last another year than let an American get credit for winning it. And Ike is letting him do it." Bradley's diary entry from September 4, 1944, is one of the most damning documents in World War II history. Bradley wrote, "Gave Patton the news about Market Garden getting priority. He took it badly, but he's right about Montgomery's motive. Montgomery is terrified that Patton will end the war before British forces cross the Rhine. Everything Montgomery proposes is designed to stop Patton's advance, not to stop the Germans. If we gave Patton the fuel, this war would be over by October. Instead, we're giving it to Montgomery for an operation that has no chance of success. History will judge this decision harshly." By September 10th, Patton's Third Army had effectively stopped advancing. Not because of German resistance. German forces in front of Patton were weak and disorganized, but because of fuel. Patton's tanks sat on roadsides, empty. His trucks were cannibalized for parts. His supply officers performed miracles to keep even minimal operations going, but the great advance was over. German commanders couldn't believe what was happening. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the West, had been preparing for disaster. He expected Patton to cross the Rhine within days. He had no forces that could stop such an advance. Model later wrote that in early September 1944, he was planning how to conduct a fighting retreat into Germany while preserving whatever forces he could. Then, on September 10th, Model's intelligence officers reported something remarkable. The American advance had stopped. Patton's Third Army, which had been racing eastward at incredible speed, was now sitting in place. Model couldn't understand why. His staff speculated that perhaps Patton was preparing for a major offensive, building up supplies for a massive assault. The truth was simpler and more damaging. Patton had been stopped by his own high command. Model ordered his staff to take advantage of the pause, bring up reinforcements, rebuild defensive positions, prepare the Siegfried Line for defense. Every day the Americans delayed was a day Germany could use to organize resistance that shouldn't have existed. September 17, 1944, Operation Martin Garden launched. At 1 p.m., over 1,400 aircraft and 500 gliders filled the skies over Holland. The 101st Airborne dropped near Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne dropped near Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne dropped near Arnhem. On the ground, British XXX Corps began its 64-mile dash up a single highway toward the bridges the paratroopers were supposed to capture. British newspapers ran ecstatic headlines. "Montgomery's masterstroke," proclaimed one. "Road to Berlin open," declared another. The BBC described Martin Garden as the operation that would end the war in days. Montgomery himself told reporters that British forces would be across the Rhine within days and deep into Germany before the month ended. At Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg, American commanders watched the reports with grim faces. Patton told his staff that Martin Garden was going to be a disaster. He predicted the British would get bogged down, the paratroopers would be cut off, and the operation would achieve nothing except wasting time and resources. Bradley agreed, but said nothing publicly. This was Montgomery's show. If it succeeded, Montgomery would get the glory. If it failed, Montgomery would bear the responsibility. Within 24 hours, Martin Garden was already in trouble. The 101st Airborne captured their bridges at Eindhoven, but German resistance was stronger than expected. The 82nd Airborne had to fight hard for the bridge at Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne found themselves facing two SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem, divisions that intelligence had said weren't there. And XXX Corps' advance up the single highway was moving far slower than planned. By September 19th, it was clear that the British paratroopers at Arnhem were in serious trouble. They had captured the north end of the Arnhem Bridge, but couldn't take the south end. German forces were surrounding them. XXX Corps was still miles away, blocked by German resistance. The British 1st Airborne was being cut to pieces. September 20th, Montgomery's staff was in crisis mode. The operation that was supposed to end the war in days was collapsing in less than a week. Montgomery ordered XXX Corps to push harder, to break through to Arnhem regardless of losses. He ordered more airdrops to supply the surrounded paratroopers. He insisted publicly that the operation was going according to plan, and success was imminent. American commanders who were following the reports knew better. Patton told Bradley on September 21st, "Monty's boys are getting slaughtered up there. This is what happens when you try to do something fast without proper preparation. But here's the thing, Brad. Monty isn't good at fast. He's never been good at fast. The only reason he tried this operation is because he couldn't stand the thought of me crossing the Rhine first." September 25th, 1944. Operation Martin Garden officially ended in failure. The British 1st Airborne Division had been destroyed. Out of 10,000 men who dropped near Arnhem, only 2,000 made it back across the river. The rest were killed or captured. American airborne divisions suffered heavy casualties. XXX Corps had advanced 60 miles but failed to reach Arnhem. The Rhine crossing had not been achieved. The Butcher's Bill was devastating. Over 17,000 Allied casualties, an entire elite division destroyed, transport aircraft lost, supplies expended, and for what? The operation had captured a salient in Holland that led nowhere. The Rhine was still a barrier, Germany was still unbroken, and the opportunity Patton had identified in early September was gone forever. Because while Montgomery was launching Martin Garden, the Germans were doing exactly what Patton had warned they would do. They were rebuilding their defenses. Field Marshal Model used the time Allied armies spent preparing for and executing Martin Garden to rush reinforcements west. The Siegfried Line fortifications were manned, artillery was positioned, tank reserves were organized. By October 1st, Germany had re-established a defensive line that hadn't existed on September 1st. This is the comparison that historians make when they analyze the September 1944 decision. On September 1st, Germany had no continuous defensive line in the west. Patton was 40 miles from the Rhine. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. By October 1st, Germany had rebuilt its defenses. The Siegfried Line was operational. The Rhine was protected by organized forces. What could have been an easy breakthrough had become a grinding war of attrition. The human cost of that transformation is staggering. In October 1944, American forces launched assaults on the Siegfried Line that cost thousands of casualties. In November, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest became one of the bloodiest engagements in U.S. military history. 19,000 American casualties fighting through fortified forest positions. In December, Hitler launched the Battle of the Bulge, catching Allied forces by surprise and causing 89,000 American casualties. None of these battles should have been necessary. If Patton had crossed the Rhine in September, if Allied forces had maintained their momentum into an undefended Germany, these defensive positions wouldn't have existed, the battles wouldn't have been fought, the casualties wouldn't have happened. After Market Garden failed, Montgomery immediately began spinning the narrative. He told reporters that the operation had been 90% successful. He claimed that capturing the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen was a significant achievement, even though the Arnhem Bridge, the crucial objective, had never been taken. He blamed bad weather for the failure. He blamed faulty intelligence. He blamed everyone except himself. Winston Churchill wasn't buying Montgomery's spin. In his private papers, later published, Churchill wrote that Market Garden had been a costly failure that wasted resources we couldn't afford to waste. Churchill understood what had really happened. Montgomery had demanded priority for an operation driven by ego rather than military logic, and British soldiers had paid the price. Churchill was furious, but he couldn't say so publicly. Britain needed Montgomery's reputation. The British public needed a hero. So Churchill stayed silent while Montgomery rewrote history. Eisenhower was having his own crisis of confidence. In late September, he met with Bradley and asked a question that revealed his doubts. Did I make the right call? Bradley was diplomatic in the meeting, but his diary tells the real story. Bradley wrote that Eisenhower knew he had made a mistake. He knew that giving Montgomery priority over Patton extended the war. But Eisenhower couldn't admit it publicly without destroying the Anglo-American alliance and his own credibility as Supreme Commander. None of Patton's battles should have been necessary. If Patton had crossed the Rhine in September, if Allied forces had maintained their momentum into an undefended Germany, these defensive positions wouldn't have existed. The battles wouldn't have been fought. The casualties wouldn't have happened. The question historians have debated for decades is simple. How much longer did Montgomery's September 1944 decisions extend World War II? The consensus that has emerged from archival research is sobering. If Patton had been given priority in early September, if he had crossed the Rhine by mid-September, if Allied forces had maintained pressure on a defenseless Germany, the war would likely have ended between December 1944 and February 1945. Instead, the war continued until May 8, 1945. That's a minimum of 3 months, possibly as long as 6 months added to the war's duration. 3 to 6 months might not sound like much, but consider what happened in those months. The Holocaust continued operating. Auschwitz wasn't liberated until January 27, 1945. Bergen-Belsen wasn't liberated until April 15, 1945. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 300,000 Jews and other victims died in Nazi concentration camps between October 1944 and May 1945, people who could have been saved if the war had ended sooner. V-2 rockets continued falling on London and Antwerp. Over 9,000 V-2s were launched, killing thousands of civilians. The V-2 campaign didn't end until March 1945, when Allied forces overran the launch sites in Holland. If Germany had collapsed in late 1944, those rockets never would have been fired.
The Eastern Front continued its bloodbath. Soviet and German casualties between October 1944 and May 1945 numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The brutal fighting across Poland and into Germany created suffering that could have been avoided if the Western Allies had forced Germany's collapse months earlier. And there were the Allied casualties from battles that shouldn't have been necessary. The Siegfried Line assaults, Hürtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, the Colmar Pocket, the Rhineland Campaign. All of these battles were fought against defensive positions that didn't exist in early September 1944. American casualties alone in these battles exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded. German commanders testified to all of this after the war. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, in his post-war interrogations, stated clearly, "If the Allies had maintained their September advance, we couldn't have stopped them. We had no reserves, no defensive line, no way to organize resistance. The decision to pause gave us time we shouldn't have had." Field Marshal Model, before his suicide in April 1945, wrote in his final report that Germany's ability to continue fighting after September 1944 was due entirely to Allied operational pauses. He specifically mentioned the halt of Patton's advance and the resources diverted to Market Garden as the two decisions that gave Germany time to rebuild. Even German intelligence officer Friedrich von Mellenthin, who wrote extensively about the war, concluded that September 1944 was Germany's most vulnerable moment. He wrote, "We were beaten. Everyone knew it. The front had collapsed. Then the Americans stopped advancing, and we couldn't understand why. That pause saved us, temporarily. The documents that would prove all of this didn't emerge immediately. In the immediate post-war years, Montgomery's version of events dominated. His 1958 memoirs, published to great fanfare, portrayed Montgomery as the steady professional and Patton as the brilliant but reckless cowboy. But in the 1970s, something changed. Archives opened, documents were declassified. Historians gained access to Bradley's diaries, Eisenhower's private correspondence, and German commanders' post-war testimonies. The truth about September 1944 started to emerge, and that truth was devastating to Montgomery's reputation. Bradley's memoirs, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, had been diplomatic but pointed. Bradley wrote that the decision to give Montgomery priority in September had been the greatest mistake of the European campaign. He wrote that Patton could have ended the war months earlier if given the resources. He wrote that Market Garden had been an ego-driven disaster that cost lives and time we couldn't afford.
But Bradley's private diaries, which weren't published until decades later, were far more damning. Bradley's September 1944 entries make clear that he believed Montgomery was deliberately sabotaging Patton's advance. Bradley wrote that Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to block Patton not for military reasons, but because Monty cannot tolerate the idea of an American general winning this war while he's still fighting for prestige. Eisenhower's post-war statements were carefully measured. He never publicly criticized Montgomery while both men were alive, but in private conversations with historians and in his unpublished papers, Eisenhower admitted his regrets. He said that the September decision had been forced on him by political necessity, not military logic. He said that if he had to do it again, he would have given Patton the fuel and dealt with the political consequences. Most tellingly, Eisenhower said in a 1964 interview, "The one decision I wish I could change from the entire war was September 1944. Patton was right about what he could do. Montgomery was wrong about Market Garden. I knew it at the time, but I convinced myself that the political situation required supporting Montgomery. I was wrong. The military situation should have been the only consideration." British historians began reassessing Montgomery's decisions as well. In the 1970s and 1980s, serious scholarly work on Market Garden concluded that the operation had been poorly conceived, inadequately planned, and driven more by Montgomery's competitive instincts than by sound military judgment. Cornelius Ryan's A Bridge Too Far, published in 1974, exposed the disasters and failures of Market Garden in devastating detail. British military historian Max Hastings wrote in the 1980s that Montgomery's September 1944 decisions reflected a general more concerned with national prestige and personal glory than with ending the war efficiently. Hastings noted that Montgomery's sudden embrace of aggressive tactics in Market Garden, after months of cautious operations, suggested that ego rather than military logic was driving his planning. The historical consensus that emerged by the 1990s was clear. Montgomery's jealousy of Patton led him to propose Market Garden primarily to prevent Patton from crossing the Rhine first. Eisenhower's decision to support Montgomery over Patton extended World War II by 3 to 6 months. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians died in that extended period who would have lived if the war had ended sooner. But here's the most damaging evidence of all. Montgomery never acknowledged any of this. In his final interviews before his death in 1976, Montgomery still insisted that Market Garden had been the right strategy. He still claimed it had been 90% successful. He still maintained that giving him priority over Patton in September 1944 had been the correct decision. Montgomery died convinced that history would vindicate him. He died believing that his memoirs and his reputation would survive intact. He died thinking that his version of events would be what people remembered. He was wrong on all counts.
The final irony is that Montgomery's September 1944 decisions destroyed exactly what he was trying to preserve. He wanted to prove that British forces were still the dominant military power in the alliance. Instead, he proved that British operations could fail spectacularly, while American operations succeeded. He wanted to prevent Patton from eclipsing him in history. Instead, he guaranteed that Patton would be remembered as the general who could have ended the war early if only he'd been given the chance. He wanted to maintain British prestige. Instead, he damaged it by wasting resources on a failed operation while the Americans sat idle with empty fuel tanks. Every goal Montgomery had in September 1944 was undermined by the decisions he made in pursuit of those goals. The lesson of September 1944 isn't complicated. When generals make decisions based on ego rather than military necessity, soldiers die. When political considerations trump operational logic, wars last longer than they should. When leaders prioritize their own reputations over their mission, everyone pays the price. In September 1944, Patton had a plan to end World War II. The plan was sound, the opportunity existed, the enemy was beaten, but the plan was never executed because one general's jealousy mattered more than ending the war. Montgomery couldn't bear the thought of Patton crossing the Rhine first, so he convinced Eisenhower to block Patton's advance and give him the resources for Market Garden instead. Market Garden failed. Patton's advance was stopped. Germany got time to rebuild defenses that shouldn't have existed. The war continued for 8 more months. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers became casualties in battles that didn't need to be fought. Hundreds of thousands of concentration camp victims died who could have been saved. V-2 rockets continued falling on cities. The Eastern Front continued its slaughter.
All of this happened because on September 4, 1944, Eisenhower chose politics over military opportunity. He chose alliance management over ending the war. He chose Montgomery's ego over Patton's plan. And history records the cost of that choice in the lives of soldiers who died between October 1944 and May 1945. Patton knew what was happening. On September 5th, the day after Eisenhower's decision, Patton wrote in his diary, "We have lost the war, not to the Germans, to our own caution and politics. We could end this in weeks. Instead, it will drag on for months, and men will die because generals care more about headlines than about victory." Patton was right. He was right about how quickly he could have crossed the Rhine. He was right that Market Garden would fail. He was right that the delay would allow Germany to rebuild its defenses. He was right that the war would be extended by months. He was right about everything except one thing. He thought that history would forget what happened in September 1944. He thought Montgomery would get away with it. But history didn't forget. The documents emerged, the truth came out, and now, decades later, we know exactly what happened. We know that one general's jealousy extended World War II. We know that tens of thousands of people died because of decisions made for ego rather than military necessity. We know that the greatest opportunity of the entire war was thrown away because Montgomery couldn't tolerate being overshadowed by Patton. The soldiers who died in Hurtgen Forest didn't know they were dying because of a decision made in early September. The paratroopers who were slaughtered at Arnhem didn't know they were being sacrificed to Montgomery's ego. The concentration camp victims who died between October and Liberation didn't know they could have been saved months earlier. They didn't know, but we know now. September 1944 was the moment. Germany was beaten. Patton had the plan. The Rhine was within reach. Victory was possible by Christmas. Then Montgomery stepped in. He convinced Eisenhower to block Patton. He demanded resources for Market Garden. He got what he wanted, and the war went on. December 21, 1945. 16 months after the September decision, George S. Patton died in a hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, from injuries sustained in a car accident. He was 60 years old.
He never got to write his memoirs. He never got to defend his September Plan in the historical record. He never got to respond to Montgomery's post-war claims. Montgomery outlived him by 31 years. For decades, Montgomery controlled the narrative. His memoirs shaped how people understood September 1944. His claims about Market Garden went unchallenged. His version of events was taught in military academies and repeated in history books. It took decades for the truth to emerge from the archives. But emerge it did, and the verdict of history is clear. Patton was right. Montgomery was wrong. Eisenhower made a mistake, and that mistake cost months of war and tens of thousands of lives. The final question is why? Why did Montgomery do it? Why did he propose Market Garden when he must have known it was risky? Why did he fight so hard to stop Patton's advance? The answer is both simple and tragic. Montgomery couldn't accept that American generals were better than he was. He couldn't accept that the balance of power in the alliance had shifted. He couldn't accept that Britain's era was ending and America's was beginning. Montgomery had built his entire reputation on being the general who saved Britain at El Alamein. He was the hero of the North African campaign. He was the man who had beaten Rommel. He was Britain's greatest living general. And now George Patton, an American general who hadn't even commanded an army until 1943, was threatening to eclipse all of Montgomery's achievements by winning World War II in 1944. Montgomery couldn't let that happen, not for military reasons, not for strategic reasons, but for reasons of ego, pride, and national prestige. So he proposed Market Garden. He convinced Eisenhower to stop Patton. He demanded resources for Market Garden. He got what he wanted, and the war went on. In September 1944, one general's jealousy extended World War II. The opportunity to end the war by Christmas was real. Patton's plan could have worked. Germany was defenseless and beaten, but Montgomery couldn't let Patton win. Eisenhower chose politics over military necessity, and tens of thousands of soldiers paid the price for that jealousy with their lives. The lesson is simple. In war, ego kills, pride kills, jealousy kills. When leaders make decisions based on personal rivalry rather than military necessity, when they prioritize their own glory over their mission, when they fight harder against their own allies than against their enemies, people die who shouldn't have to. Montgomery fought harder to stop Patton than to stop the Germans in September 1944, and because of that, World War II lasted months longer than it had to. The Rhine could have been crossed in September. Germany could have collapsed by Christmas. The war could have ended in early 1945 at the latest. Instead, the war continued till May 8, 1945, and every soldier who died between September 1944 and May 1945 in battles against defensive positions that shouldn't have existed died because one general's ego mattered more than ending the war. That's the truth about September 1944. That's what the archives reveal. That's what history records. Patton had a plan to end the war. Montgomery buried it, and the cost was measured in months, battles, and lives that never should have been lost.